Hello all. Can you spare just a few minutes to talk about 1 John chapter 2 verses 1 through 6? Good. You might recall that in chapter 1 verses 8 through 10, John says that sin is characteristic of our lives. All of us sin, even Christians. But then when he comes to chapter 2 and verse 1, he says, I write this to you so that you may not sin. Now that might sound a little bit confusing to us, where on the one hand he says, you're going to sin, and then on the other hand he says, I don't want you to sin. I write this so that you might not sin. A little bit confusing perhaps. But I think we can make sense of it if we consider this. It's possible that some of his readers might interpret what he wrote there in chapter 1 verses 8 through 10 as a license to sin. After all, if sin was characteristic of a Christian, and if forgiveness was freely available, well, the readers might well have reacted like the people who asked, shall we continue in sin that grace may abound? Romans chapter 6 and verse 1. I mean, if we're sinners and God is gracious, why don't we just sin all that we want to so that it makes God's grace look all the more beautiful? Well, John makes it quite clear in chapter 2 and verse 1 that his purpose was that Christians should not sin. Our aim is to be as far away from sin as possible. But then he tells us that there is a remedy for sin, and aren't these beautiful verses? Oh, gorgeous verses. We have a remedy for sin, and of course that remedy is not a thing, but a person. That remedy is Jesus Christ, our Lord, and the blood that he shed for us. He gives us a couple of images here. He goes from the heavenly court to the heavenly temple. He tells us that Jesus is our advocate, our paraclete. And a good definition of that word is this: a friendly representative who defends one's cause, usually by influential intercession. Well, that's kind of wordy, isn't it? Think about a counsel for the defense, a defense lawyer, someone who intercedes for us and pleads our case, in this case, before God our Father. Jesus is our counsel for the defense. He pleads our case for us. But then John tells us that he's also our atoning sacrifice. This is language from the Old Testament. Jesus is the sacrifice, or he provides the sacrifice that makes us one with God, that makes it possible for us to be united with God. Think of a covering over or a blotting out of sin. Jesus removes our sin by his blood, sin which separates us from God. And having removed that sin and canceled that sin and erased that sin, we now can have a relationship with God. And as he says in this verse, the sacrifice of Jesus does not have a mere limited efficacy. It has universal application. Jesus died for the sins of the whole world. The possibility is there for every person in the world to be forgiven. No one is outside the reach of God's forgiveness because of the wonderful sacrifice of Jesus. And then, in chapter 2, verses 3 through 6, John talks about the knowledge of God, and he tells us that the certainty of knowing God is demonstrated by what? Verse 3, by keeping his commandments. That is, keeping the commandments of God is a test or proof of knowing God. And he says this is how we may be sure that we are in him, that we have union with him. We live as Jesus lived. We walk as Jesus walked. That's verse 6. Now, the application here is far-reaching. I just want to mention a couple of things. You notice probably in verse 3 that John brings up the possibility of knowing God by what he says. By this we may be sure that we know him. Oh, knowing God is possible. Our great question, of course, is what does it mean to know God? What does it mean to have a close, intimate, personal relationship with him? Well, I think that's probably something of what it means to know God, but I just want us to dwell upon this great blessing that we can know God. And John says that is possible here. This was language that was often talked about in the ancient world. Knowing God, or knowing the divine. What did it mean to know God? And the fact that John mentions here that we can know God is a great blessing to each of us who wants to draw closer to God. Then, how does a person know that he knows God? And John's answer is clearly by keeping his commandments. The test of whether or not we know God is if we are keeping God's commandments. This is the tangible evidence of the presence of our love for God. In the next section, he's going to talk about the importance of loving one another, as you've already seen, because we've already spent some time in the opening verses of this next passage, which begins in verse 7 and takes us through verse what? Verse 11. I'll see you in a few days, and we'll talk about those verses 7 through 11 in chapter 2, and the importance of loving one another. This is a second test that we know God. In the meantime, I want to say this to you. If you have any questions about what you read, if there's some text here that you find hard to understand, or you want some clarification, well, let me know. And together, we'll try to find the answer to your questions. I want this to be an interactive study. That's what I'm trying to say. So if we can help each other, that is great. And again, I'm so glad you're in this study with us. God bless.